Hello there, and welcome. Tonight, we begin a quiet journey together, not into the realm of fiction or fantasy, but into the deep green heart of a very real and ancient story. It's a story about fear and hope and the first shield humanity ever raised against the darkness. It's the story of how certain plants, in their quiet, unassuming way, became our first guardians. We're going to explore the idea of Apotropaic botany, a wonderful formal name for something you already instinctively understand, the belief that a plant can stand as a shield against the unseen. Long before science gave us names for viruses and bacteria, our ancestors saw the world as full of invisible forces, some benevolent, some deeply malevolent, and in their search for protection, they didn't look to iron or steel first, they looked to the garden. If you enjoy what we do here in our quiet little community, this shared space of wonder, you might consider letting me know with a like or a comment. It's always a quiet joy to see these stories resonate, and as always, I love to see where everyone is listening from tonight, from a quiet town in the English countryside, to a bustling city in Japan, to a home nestled in the mountains of Peru. It feels as though we're all gathered around a soft digital campfire, sharing a story under the same stars. It's a beautiful thought. But for now, it's time to let all of that go. Let's leave the day behind. Find that perfect spot on your pillow, the one that feels like it was made just for you. Dim the lights if you haven't already, and let the world outside your window fade away. Close your eyes and take a slow, deep breath. And as you exhale, feel the weight of your body settling in, growing heavy, comfortable and still. We are about to travel back in time, not with a machine, but with our imagination. Let's shrink down, past the noise of our modern world, and listen for the echoes in the garden. Chapter 1. Echoes in the Garden. The Ancient Roots of Apotropaic Botany. Before we had written words, we had the language of the world. The world spoke in the rumble of thunder, the pattern of stars, the sudden flight of a startled bird, and it spoke, most intimately, in the rustle of leaves, the unfurling of a petal, the sharp warning of a thorn. To our most distant ancestors, the forest was not just a collection of resources, it was a library of living symbols, a vocabulary of survival and meaning. A plant was never just a plant, it was a story, it was a promise, a threat, a medicine, or a prayer. And in a world teeming with invisible dangers, with ill fortune, malevolent spirits, the evil eye, the breath of disease, humanity, in its profound vulnerability, searched for allies. We were soft-skinned, slow, and keenly aware of the fragility of our own existence. We needed guardians, and so we looked to our silent, rooted neighbors and began to learn their language. This is the very beginning of Apotropaic botany. The word itself, apotropaic, comes from the Greek apotropaios, which simply means to turn away or to ward off. It is the magic of deflection, the art of creating a boundary. It's a human impulse as universal as seeking shelter from the rain. And for millennia, our preferred shelter was woven from leaves, stems, and roots. But how did we choose? Out of the millions of species of plants on this earth, how did certain ones become so universally endowed with protective power? It wasn't random. It was the result of thousands of years of the most intimate, patient observation. Our ancestors were the most brilliant naturalists. They listened to the world with their entire beings, with their eyes, their noses, their hands, their tongues. And they found that the plants most capable of defending themselves, or of creating profound changes in the human body, must surely possess a power that extended beyond the visible world. They identified 3 essential qualities, 3 chapters in the language of protective flora, the power of pungency, the architecture of defense, and the sermon of purity. Let's begin with the most immediate, the most visceral of these, the power of pungency. Imagine you are walking through the quiet, damp earth of an ancient garden. You kneel down, your hands brushing against the soil, and you pull a small pale bulb from the ground. You peel away its dry, papery skin, and with your thumbnail you break one of the cloves within. and in that instant, the air changes. A scent, sharp, hot, and undeniable, floods your senses. It's a chemical shout, an olfactory alarm system. This is the power of the Allium family, of garlic, of onions, of leeks. Today, we understand this power on a molecular level. We know that when the cell walls of a garlic clove are ruptured, an enzyme called alliinase instantly converts a compound called alliin into allicin. Allicin is a sulfur compound, and it is a fantastically potent weapon. It is nature's own broad-spectrum antibiotic, antifungal, and pest repellent. It is the plant's way of screaming, "Do not eat me, I am not to..." The plant evolved this chemical arsenal to protect itself from insects, from nematodes in the soil, from the relentless onslaught of fungi and bacteria. Our ancestors, of course, did not have the language of enzymes and sulfur compounds, but they had something just as powerful, their own senses. They recognized that this pungent force, this invisible shield that the plant deployed, was a form of power, a vitality, and if it could so potently affect the world around it, driving away pests, preserving food from decay, then surely its power could extend to those invisible pests that plagued humanity, the spirits of sickness, the carriers of misfortune, the unseen things that lurked in the night. Let's travel to ancient Egypt, to the sun-baked banks of the Nile, more than 4,000 years ago. Here, garlic was not a mere seasoning. It was currency, it was medicine, it was divine. The historian Herodotus tells us that the builders of the Great Pyramid of Giza were given a daily ration of garlic and onions, not just for flavor, but for strength and stamina, to keep them healthy and robust under the grueling Egyptian sun. They believed its inner fire would fuel their own. They saw its pungent vitality as a direct transference of power from the earth to man. In the tomb of Tutankhamun, among the gold and lapis lazuli, archaeologists found perfectly preserved clay models of garlic bulbs placed there to sustain and protect the young pharaoh in the afterlife. They believed its potent aroma would ward off the malevolent spirits that sought to obstruct his journey through the underworld. It wasn't just food for the body, it was armor for the soul. The very thing that made it pungent, that made it shout in the air, was its magic. It created an invisible fence of scent, a barrier that the forces of decay and darkness could not cross. Now let us let the Egyptian sands drift away and find ourselves in the bustling, ordered world of the Roman Empire. Here the belief in garlic's protective power was just as strong, but it was codified, studied, and prescribed. Pliny the Elder, the great Roman naturalist and commander, wrote extensively about garlic in his work, Naturalis Historia. He listed dozens of ailments that it could cure, from dog bites to epilepsy. But more than that, he noted its use as a guardian. Roman soldiers marched to conquer the known world, with garlic tucked into their provisions, believing it instilled courage and protected them from both sickness and sorcery. Roman sailors would hang braids of garlic from the masts of their ships, a fragrant offering to ward off tempests and sea monsters. In the countryside, a farmer would hang a string of garlic over the doorway of his home. We can look at this and see simple superstition, but let's look closer, with the eyes of a naturalist. That farmer's world was one where a sudden fever could wipe out a family, where food spoilage meant starvation, where insects could decimate a crop. The pungent cloud of garlic's sulfur compounds wafting from the doorway would have genuinely repelled mosquitoes and other disease-carrying insects. Its antimicrobial properties would have been known to anyone who used it to help preserve meats. They observed a real, tangible protective effect. They saw that life was healthier, safer within the circle of its influence. And so it was the most logical step in the world to assume that if it could ward off the visible threats, the fly, the rot, it could surely ward off the invisible ones, the evil eye, the envious neighbor's curse, the restless spirit. Garlic's power was its voice. It spoke a language that both the seen and unseen worlds seemed to understand. It was a declaration of presence, of vitality, of a space that was occupied and defended. Let's just pause on that for a moment. The simple act of crushing a garlic clove releases a chemical defense mechanism that is millions of years old, a system so effective, so potent, that it impressed itself upon the human imagination with the force of divine revelation. We didn't invent the magic of garlic. We simply recognized it. We gave it a human name and a human story, but the power itself was always there, waiting in the quiet earth. It's humbling, really. From the language of scent, our ancestors also learned to read the language of touch, of form, of structure. This brings us to the second great pillar of apotropaic botany, the architecture of defense. If pungency is a chemical shout, then a thorn is a silent physical spear. It is a plant's passive, permanent declaration of its own sovereignty. A thorn, a spine, a prickle. These are all modifications of a plant's own tissues, stems or leaves, hardened into sharp defensive points. They are nature's barbed wire, its caltrops, its sentinels. They exist for one reason: to inflict pain upon anything that would harm the plant. And to our ancestors, this was a clear and powerful statement. A plant that could so readily defend its own physical body was seen as a natural fortress. Let us imagine a windswept hillside in medieval Europe. A small cottage, thatched with straw, stands against the grey sky. Surrounding this small plot of land, this fragile bubble of human warmth and life, is a thick, tangled and impenetrable hedge of hawthorn. In the spring, it is a cloud of delicate white blossoms, but for the rest of the year, it is a formidable wall of interlocking woody branches, each armed with needle-sharp thorns. This hedge was a practical barrier. It kept out stray livestock and would-be thieves. It was a living fence, a boundary marker that clearly defined the domestic space from the wild world beyond. But it was so much more than that. In the folklore of the British Isles and much of Europe, the hawthorn was a sacred, magical tree. It was believed to be a gateway to the other world, the realm of the Fae, or fairies. These beings were not the tiny, glittering sprites of modern stories. They were powerful, capricious, and often dangerous entities. A hawthorn hedge, therefore, was not just a physical boundary. It was a magical one. Its thorns were thought to be able to snare malevolent spirits, to confuse them, to create a labyrinth of pain from which they could not escape. Planting a hawthorn was an act of magical engineering, creating a literal and supernatural line of defense around one's home and family. It was believed that witches could not cross a hawthorn hedge, that they would become tangled and trapped in its thorny embrace. It was the plant's own defensive nature writ large and repurposed for human protection. The symbolism is so beautifully direct. The plant says, "Come no closer," and our ancestors listened. They saw that the hawthorn protected itself with an army of tiny spears, and so they invited it to stand guard over their homes. They co-opted its natural defense system for their own spiritual security. Let's travel back again to the arid landscapes of ancient Egypt. Here, a different thorny tree held immense power, the acacia. The acacia tree is a masterpiece of survival in a harsh environment. It has deep roots to find water, tiny leaves to prevent moisture loss, and it is ferociously armed with long, sharp thorns. To the ancient Egyptians, who lived their lives in a thin, fertile ribbon of green surrounded by a vast and hostile desert, the acacia was a symbol of resilience, of life persisting against all odds. It was sacred to the gods, particularly Osiris, the god of the afterlife. The myths said that the first gods were born from beneath an acacia tree. Its wood was used to build sacred barges and temples. Its thorns were its protective aura. Amulets were carved from its wood. Its branches were placed in tombs to protect the deceased on their perilous journey. Just as the hawthorn's thorns were thought to snare European witches, the acacia's thorns were believed to ward off the demons and monsters that populated the Egyptian underworld. It's a beautiful example of convergent belief, born from the same fundamental observation. Two vastly different cultures, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, both looked at a thorny plant and came to the exact same conclusion. That which defends itself can also defend me. They recognized that the physical form of the plant was an expression of its inner nature. The thorns were not an accident, they were an intention to survive, to protect, to create a safe space, and that is precisely what our ancestors were trying to do. They were building a garden of magical security, and they used nature's own architects to design it. From the palpable warnings of scent and touch, we move to a more subtle, but perhaps even more profound form of power, the sermon of purity. This is the apotropaic magic of symbolism, of color, of form. It is the belief that certain plants, by their very appearance, embodied a state of perfection and holiness that was anathema to forces of darkness and corruption. And the most powerful symbol in this botanical language was the color white. Across countless cultures, the color white has been associated with light, divinity, innocence, and purity. It is the color of fresh snow, of clean water, of untainted milk. It is the absence of stain, of shadow, of decay. Evil, in most belief systems, is associated with darkness, filth, and corruption. Therefore, a pure white flower was not just a beautiful object. It was a living rebuttal to the forces of darkness. It was a botanical sermon. Its very presence was thought to create a space of spiritual cleanliness, a sanctuary where evil could not gain a foothold. Let us return to the muddy banks of the Nile. Every morning, as the sun rises, a miracle occurs. From the murky, stagnant water, a flower emerges, its petals unfolding in the growing light, perfectly clean, exquisitely beautiful, radiant. This is the blue lotus, or Nymphaea caerulea. To the ancient Egyptians, this was the ultimate symbol of creation, rebirth and purity. The world, they believed, was born from a giant lotus flower that rose from the primordial waters of chaos. The flower's ability to emerge spotless from the mud was a daily reenactment of creation itself. It was a demonstration that light and purity could triumph over darkness and chaos. Therefore, the lotus was imbued with immense protective power. It was depicted everywhere, in tombs, on temple walls, in the hands of gods and pharaohs. Its fragrance was thought to be divine. They believed that to be in the presence of the lotus was to be in the presence of the sacred. It purified the air, it calmed the spirit, and it protected the soul. To offer a lotus to the dead was to grant them the flower's own power of rebirth, to ensure they too could rise pure and clean from the darkness of the underworld into the eternal light. Its magic was not in a thorn or a pungent oil. It was in its story, in its symbolic perfection. It was a living prayer. Now let us travel forward in time to medieval Europe and enter a quiet monastery garden. Here, another white flower stands tall and serene, the Madonna lily, Lilium candidum, with its large trumpet-shaped blossoms of the purest white and its heavenly fragrance. It became one of the most potent symbols in Christianity. It was inextricably linked with the Virgin Mary, representing her purity, innocence, and divine grace. To plant a lily in one's garden, or to bring its blossoms into the home, was more than just decoration. It was an invitation to the sacred. It was an act of consecrating the space. The flower's perfect whiteness was seen as a reflection of divine light, a light that would naturally drive out any lurking shadows. It was believed that demons and evil spirits, being creatures of filth and corruption, could not bear to be in the presence of such profound purity. The lily didn't need to be pungent or thorny. Its power was its holiness. It fought darkness not with a weapon, but with an overwhelming presence of light. It was a quiet, fragrant guardian, a constant, living reminder of the sacred, turning a simple home into a small chapel. This belief is so deeply intuitive. When we are afraid, we seek the light. We seek cleanliness. We seek order. These white flowers were the botanical embodiment of all those things. They were a source of psychological comfort, a visual anchor in a chaotic world. They didn't need to be scientifically proven to repel evil. Their effect on the human spirit was proof enough. They created a sense of peace, of sanctity, of safety, and in a world filled with fear, that feeling of safety was the most powerful magic of all. Beyond the immediate statements of pungency, thorns, and color, there was another category of protective plants, one that spoke in the slow, deep language of seasons and cycles. This was the promise of the evergreen. In much of the world, the year is a story of life and death. The vibrant green of spring and summer gives way to the decay of autumn, and then to the stark-seeming death of winter. The trees stand like skeletons against a grey sky. The earth is cold and hard. For our ancestors, this was a time of great anxiety. The world appeared to die, and they could only hope and pray for its return. It was a time when the forces of darkness and decay seemed to be in their ascendancy. And yet, in the midst of this apparent death, some plants held their ground. The laurel, the rosemary, the holly, the yew, the pine, they remained green. They were a defiant splash of life in a monochrome landscape of sleep. They were a quiet promise that life had not been extinguished, only hidden. And this incredible resilience, this refusal to surrender to the darkness of winter, was seen as a sign of immense power. An evergreen plant possessed a special kind of vitality, an eternal life force that the changing seasons could not defeat. And so humanity turned to these plants as allies against the spiritual winter of fear and death. Let us stand in ancient Rome once more. A victorious general returns from battle, parading through the streets in a triumph. Upon his head is not a crown of gold, but a wreath of laurel. The laurel, or bay, was sacred to the god Apollo, the god of light, prophecy, and purification. It was an evergreen, its glossy dark leaves a symbol of eternal life and victory. The laurel wreath was not just an award, it was a protective amulet. It was believed to shield the wearer from all harm, not just from human enemies, but from lightning, from disease, and from evil spirits. The Romans would plant laurel trees by their doorways to purify the home and protect it from misfortune. The leaves were burned as incense to cleanse a space of negative influences. Its power came from its connection to a god of light and its own unwavering evergreen nature. It was a symbol of triumph over all forms of darkness, whether on the battlefield or in the soul. Moving again to the cottages and castles of later Europe, we find another evergreen holding a place of honor, rosemary. Its name, rosmarinus, means dew of the sea, and its fragrant, needle-like leaves were a constant presence in daily life. It was a culinary herb, yes, but its true importance was as a plant of remembrance, loyalty, and protection. Rosemary's strong, clean, pine-like scent was seen as a powerful purifying agent. In an age before sanitation, when disease was a constant threat, bundles of rosemary were burned in sick rooms and in the courts of law to fumigate the air, to drive away the bad air or miasma that was believed to cause illness. Here again, the line between medicine and magic is beautifully blurred. They observed that the pungent smoke seemed to keep sickness at bay, a very real effect of its antiseptic and insect-repelling essential oils. They concluded that it was cleansing the air, not just of physical impurities, but of spiritual ones as well. Sprigs of rosemary were placed under the pillows of children to ward off nightmares and evil spirits. They were carried in the pockets of travelers to ensure a safe journey. They were woven into wedding wreaths to promote fidelity, and they were laid in coffins to ensure the deceased would be remembered and protected on their final journey. Like the laurel, rosemary's power was twofold. It had a strong, active, purifying scent, a form of pungency, but it also had the passive, constant power of its evergreen nature. It was a reminder, even in the depths of winter, even in the face of sickness and death, that life and memory persist. It was a green guardian, a fragrant shield against the forces of decay and forgetting. And so we see how our ancestors, with no tools but their senses and their deep, abiding connection to the natural world, built a complex and powerful system of belief. It was a system born not of ignorance but of profound intimacy. They understood that the world was a dangerous and unpredictable place, and they found strength and solace in the perceived powers of the plants that grew around them. The sharp scent of garlic, a chemical defense against pests, became a shield against demons. The painful thorns of the hawthorn, a physical defense against herbivores, became a barrier against witches. The pure white of the lily, A simple matter of pigmentation to attract pollinators became a beacon of divine light that repelled all darkness. The persistent green of the rosemary, a biological adaptation to survive the cold, became a symbol of eternal life that could conquer death itself. This was not foolishness. It was a form of poetry. It was a way of reading the world, of finding meaning and agency in a universe that often seemed chaotic and hostile. Our ancestors were looking for allies, for guardians, for tools to help them navigate the terrifying uncertainties of life, and they found them in the quiet, rooted and resilient world of plants. They saw in a plant's struggle for its own survival a reflection of their own, and in the clever and varied ways that plants had learned to protect themselves, they saw a blueprint for their own protection. They were listening to the echoes in the garden, and those echoes told them that they were not alone. The seeds of the story we are here to tell, the story of a very particular plant and a very particular monster, were planted in this ancient fertile soil of belief, watered by millennia of human fear and hope. A story written not in ink, but in chlorophyll and folklore. Chapter 2. A Thorny Defense. The botanical rivals to Dracula's Bane. And so that story, written in chlorophyll and folklore, began to branch. Before a single name, a single plant, came to dominate the pages of this strange and fearful history, there was a whole forest of contenders, a whole pharmacopoeia of protection. Humanity, in its search for a shield against the dark, did not settle on the first thing it found. It experimented, it observed. It listened to the whispers of 1,000 different leaves and the warnings of 100 different thorns. What we are exploring tonight are the runners-up in this ancient contest, the powerful and revered botanical rivals who, in another telling of the tale, might have become the one true bane of the creature of the night. These are the forgotten champions, the regional defenders, each with its own story, its own particular genius for keeping the living safe from the restless dead. Our journey begins with a tree that is less a single organism and more a living fortress. A plant whose very name in Old English means, simply, hedge-thorn, the hawthorn. If you were to design a barrier, a living wall to protect a homestead or a sacred place, you could do no better than this remarkable engineer. It doesn't grow with the elegant simplicity of a pine or the soaring ambition of an oak. The hawthorn grows in a state of chaotic, determined defense. It is a tangle of contradictions. In the spring it is a vision of impossible gentleness, erupting in clouds of creamy white or blushing pink blossoms, so dense they can obscure the branches beneath. The air around it grows thick with a sweet, almost cloying scent. It is a fragrance that has long been associated with both life and death, a complex perfume containing a chemical called trimethylamine, one of the first compounds released when living tissue begins to decay. And so, even in its moment of most vibrant life, the hawthorn speaks in the language of mortality, a fitting guardian for the threshold between worlds. But beneath this delicate veil of blossoms lies its true nature. The wood of the hawthorn is a masterpiece of density and resilience. It is pale, fine-grained, and incredibly hard, burning with a fierce, clean heat. But it is the thorns that are its signature, its irrefutable statement of purpose. These are not the gentle prickles of a rose. A hawthorn thorn is a biological dagger. It is not an extension of the bark, but a modified branch, a woody, needle-sharp spike that grows directly from the deep, hard wood of the parent stem. They can be inches long, strong enough to puncture leather, and they stand out at aggressive angles from the twisted, interlocking branches. To walk into a thicket of hawthorn is to understand the meaning of the word impenetrable. Each step is a negotiation with 1,000 tiny spears. It is this very quality that made it the plant of choice for hedgerows across Europe for centuries. These were not merely property lines, they were fortifications. A well-laid hawthorn hedge could turn livestock and discourage intruders with an efficiency that no simple fence could ever match. It was a living barbed wire, a patient, growing garrison. And so, when people imagined a creature that could pass through walls and seep under doors, a being of mist and shadow, their minds turned to the one barrier that even in the real world seemed absolute. They saw the hawthorn hedge not just as a physical obstacle, but as a metaphysical one, a line drawn in the earth, not of stone or iron, but of living armed wood. It was believed that a vampire, a creature of unnatural appetites and profane power, could not pass through such a hedge. The sacred tangled life of the hawthorn was a puzzle it could not solve, a bastion it could not breach. A home surrounded by a hawthorn hedge was a sanctuary, insulated from the wandering night. This belief went deeper than just the hedge. The wood itself was thought to carry the tree's protective spirit. It was from this dense, unyielding wood that people carved amulets and talismans, but its most famous and most grisly application was, of course, the stake. While pop culture has often favored simple, splintered wood, folklore was far more specific. To truly pin a vampire to the earth, to return its unnatural form to the stillness of death, the tool had to be special. It had to be made of a wood that held power, and hawthorn, along with ash and oak, was a prime candidate. Imagine the effort to fell a hawthorn, to work its notoriously tough wood, to shape a point from a material that seems to fight back at every turn. This was not a simple act. It was a ritual. The very difficulty of the task imbued the finished object with a sense of immense power and intention. Driving a hawthorn stake through the heart of the undead was not just a physical act of destruction, it was a symbolic act of imposing the order of the natural world, in its toughest and most resilient form, upon a creature that defied that very order. The thorn tree, the guardian of boundaries, was being used to enforce the ultimate boundary, the one between life and death. And the hawthorn had another layer of power, one that connected it not just to the physical world, but to the spiritual. In Celtic lands it was known as a fairy tree, a gateway to the other world. A lone hawthorn standing in a field was treated with immense respect and profound superstition. It was a place where the veil between worlds was thin. To damage such a tree was to invite terrible luck. This liminal status made it the perfect guardian. A tree that already stands at a mystical crossroads is the ideal sentry to post against a creature that is itself caught between two states of being. The hawthorn's magic was not just protective, it was jurisdictional. It was the warden of the borderlands. Even its medicinal uses seem to echo this folklore. For centuries, herbalists have used the leaves, flowers, and the bright red berries, the haws, to create tonics for the heart. Extracts of hawthorn are known to improve cardiovascular function, to strengthen the muscle of the heart, to regulate its beat. Think of that. The very plant believed to be the material for the stake that could pierce a vampire's heart was also the one used to strengthen and protect the living heart from disease. In the quiet logic of folklore, this is no coincidence. The hawthorn protects the heart, whether from physical ailment or from the life-draining horror of the undead. It is the steadfast guardian of the body's most vital rhythm. So the hawthorn stood as a formidable contender, a fortress, a weapon, a mystical gateway, and a healer. Its defense was direct, physical, and uncompromising. It offered a brutal, tangible solution to a supernatural problem. It met the fangs and claws of the monster with its own arsenal of sharpened wood. But not all defenses are a fortress wall. Some are a net. If the hawthorn was a legion of tiny spearmen, our next rival was a graceful but relentless entanglement, a web of thorns and beauty. We turn from the dense thicket to the scrambling, reaching canes of the wild rose. Specifically the dog rose, Rosa canina. Its name has nothing to do with canines in the way we think of them, but comes from the classical belief that its root could be used to treat the bite of a mad dog. But the shape of its thorns, sharp and hooked like a dog's tooth, gives the name a certain poetic truth. Unlike the straight woody daggers of the hawthorn, the thorns of the wild rose are a feat of biomechanical engineering designed for one purpose: to climb. The wild rose is not a tree that stands on its own authority. It is a scrambler, an opportunist. It uses other plants, old walls, and forgotten fences as its ladder to the sun. And its thorns are its climbing gear. They are grappling hooks. They snag, they grip, they hold fast, allowing the long, flexible canes to pull themselves upward, ever closer to the light. Anyone who has tried to prune a wild rose or clear a bramble patch knows the tenacity of this grip. The thorns don't just prick you, they cling to your clothes, they tear at your skin. To move through a wild rose thicket is to be constantly caught, snagged, and held. It is a plant that says, "You will not pass easily." And in this clinging, grasping nature, folklore found a unique form of protection. The primary belief associated with the wild rose was not that it formed an impenetrable barrier, but that it could ensnare and hold a vampire. It was a common practice in many parts of Europe to place the thorny branches of a wild rose upon a fresh grave, especially one of a person suspected of returning. The idea was that should the corpse attempt to rise, it would become hopelessly entangled in the web of thorns. Like a fly in a spider's web, the more it struggled, the more deeply it would be ensnared. It was a trap, a botanical net that would hold the creature fast until the first rays of the sun could find it and dissolve it into dust. This is a different kind of magic from the hawthorn's brutal finality. It is a passive, patient defense. It's a strategy of delay, of entanglement. It plays on the idea that the undead, for all their power, are creatures of simple, linear purpose. A complex physical puzzle like a web of hooked thorns is something their unnatural minds cannot navigate. They are driven by a singular hunger, and the rose presents them with 1,000 tiny problems, 1,000 little hooks that hold them back from their prey. There is also the profound symbolism of the rose itself. The delicate 5-petaled flower, in shades of soft white and gentle pink, is a near universal symbol of love, beauty, and purity. In Christian tradition, it became associated with the Virgin Mary, the Rosa Mystica, or a symbol of the blood of the martyrs. To place this emblem of ultimate purity and sacred love upon a grave was to create a powerful ward against the profane and the corrupted. The vampire, a being defined by its perversion of life and love, turning the lover's bite into a curse of death, could not abide such a symbol. The thorns were the physical trap, the flower was the spiritual one. And like the hawthorn, the wild rose offers its own medicine, its own gift of vitality to the living. After the petals fall, the flower's base swells and ripens into a bright scarlet fruit known as a rosehip. These hips are one of nature's most concentrated sources of vitamin C. For millennia, they have been gathered in the autumn to make syrups, jams, and teas, powerful remedies against scurvy and the illnesses of winter. A single spoonful of rosehip syrup was a burst of concentrated life, a way to bolster the body's defenses and strengthen its vitality. Here again, the symmetry of folklore is so beautiful. The vampire is a creature that drains life, that saps vitality and health, leaving its victims pale and weak. And the wild rose offers the perfect antidote, a fruit bursting with the very essence of health, a tonic that strengthens the living and makes them more resilient. It fights the vampire not just by trapping its body, but by fortifying the bodies of its potential victims. It is both a lock on the tomb and a boost to the immune system. Imagine a cottage in some forgotten corner of the mountains. A hawthorn hedge surrounds it, a formidable wall, and over the stone fence by the gate, a wild rose has tangled itself. Its pink blossoms a sign of beauty, its hooked thorns a quiet warning. Inside, on the shelf, a jar of hawthorn berry tincture sits next to a bottle of deep red rosehip syrup. This wasn't just superstition, it was a holistic system of defense. The plants provided a shield for the home, for the grave, and for the body itself. They were partners in the fight for life, offering their thorns, their flowers, their wood, and their fruit to the cause. From the fortress and the net, we now move to a different kind of power, a power that is less about physical defense and more about an innate, sacred authority. We leave the thorny lowlands and climb higher, to the windy slopes and rocky crags where our next contender grows. A slender, graceful tree with bark as smooth and grey as a stormy sky, and berries that burn like embers against the autumn gloom. This is the rowan, or mountain ash. First, we must be clear. The rowan, Sorbus aucuparia, is not a true ash tree at all. It is a member of the rose family, a cousin to the hawthorn and the wild rose we have just met. It gets its common name, mountain ash, from the similarity of its leaves, delicate, pinnate structures made of many small leaflets to those of the true ash tree. But the rowan is its own creature entirely, a tree of wild, lonely places, a pioneer species that can cling to life on nutrient-poor soil where other trees would fail. It has a resilience, a quiet toughness that belies its delicate appearance. In the spring, it produces flat-topped clusters of creamy, almost foamy flowers with a strong musky scent. But it is in the late summer and autumn that the rowan truly comes into its glory. The flowers give way to dense, hanging bunches of the most brilliant scarlet berries. On a grey, misty day in the highlands, a rowan tree in full fruit looks like it is on fire, a beacon of defiant colour against a monochrome world. The Latin name, Occuparia, means to catch birds, as fowlers would use the bright berries to bait traps. The birds know, as our ancestors did, that this tree is a source of life. The berries, while too bitter and astringent to eat raw, are rich in vitamins and can be cooked into a sharp, tangy jelly that is the perfect accompaniment to game meats. Once again, we find a plant associated with protection that also provides sustenance and health. It is a recurring theme. The plants that guard life are also the plants that nourish it. But the power of the rowan in folklore transcends its physical properties. Of all the trees in European lore, especially Celtic and Slavic traditions, the rowan is arguably the most powerful protector against evil. It was called witchwood, not because it was used by witches, but because it was the ultimate defense against them. Its power extended to all manner of dark forces, evil spirits, enchantments, and most certainly the undead. Its protective magic was considered so inherent, so absolute, that its mere presence was a shield. It was the most desired tree to have growing by your house, especially near the door. A home guarded by a rowan was a home blessed with safety. People would not just rely on a living tree, they would bring its power inside. Twigs of rowan, often tied together with a red thread into the shape of a cross or a star, were hung over the doorways of homes and barns, tucked into the beams of the roof, or placed in cradles to protect sleeping infants. The red thread was thought to amplify the magic, a color of life and blood used to bind the protective wood. Travelers would carry a walking stick of rowan wood for protection on long, lonely journeys. Dairymaids would use a stirring stick of rowan to protect the milk and butter from being bewitched. Its wood was almost never burned as common fuel, for to do so would be an insult to its spirit. This was not just a plant, it was a sacred ally. What was the source of this immense power? Part of it comes from its association with wild, untamed nature. It is a tree of the mountains, of the liminal spaces beyond the soft, cultivated fields. But there is a more specific mark, a tiny secret hidden on each and every berry. If you look closely at the bottom of a rowan berry, where the flower once was, you will see a small, dark, five-pointed star, a perfect miniature pentagram. In ancient traditions, the pentagram was a powerful symbol of protection, its 5 points representing the elements or other mystical concepts, its continuous line a perfect, unbroken ward. To find this symbol occurring naturally, perfectly formed on the fruit of a tree, was a sign of immense significance. It was as if nature itself had branded this tree as a guardian. Each tiny berry was a shield, a naturally occurring amulet. The tree did not just have protective properties, it was literally covered in protective symbols. In Slavic folklore, the connection to vampires, or vordalacs, is even more direct and gruesome than in Western European traditions. It was believed that if a person was suspected of becoming a vampire, their body should be exhumed and pierced with a stake of rowan wood, and in some traditions, the branches of the rowan tree were used to pin the body into its coffin, a sacred binding that the creature could not break. The rowan did not just repel, it subdued. It did not just create a barrier, it was a cage. Unlike the hawthorn's aggressive thorns or the rose's entangling grip, the rowan's defense was perceived as something deeper, a kind of quiet, spiritual authority. It was a calm, unwavering presence that evil simply could not tolerate. Its power was not in a wound it could inflict, but in its very essence. It was a holy tree, and the unholy could not abide its shadow. Holding a piece of rowan was like holding a fragment of sacred ground, a portable sanctuary. It was the ultimate shield, forged not by human hands, but by the patient, mysterious intelligence of the wild wood itself. And so we see the evolution of strategy, from the physical wall of the hawthorn, to the entangling net of the rose, to the sacred aura of the rowan. Each represents a different theory of defense, a different understanding of the enemy. But what if the enemy's weakness was not its fear of the physical, or its aversion to the holy? What if its weakness was in its very mind? Our final contender takes us on a dramatic shift in scale, from the mighty tree to the humble, almost infinitesimal seed. It offers perhaps the most bizarre and clever defense of all. It did not rely on thorns, or sacred wood, or symbols of purity. It relied on mathematics. It sought to defeat the monster not with a stake, but with a simple, mind-numbingly tedious task. We are speaking, of course, of mustard seeds. The mustard plant, a member of the widespread and useful Brassica family, is in many ways an unassuming creature. It often grows as a weed, a volunteer in fields and on roadsides, bursting forth with a haze of cheerful four-petaled yellow flowers. It is a survivor, an opportunist, producing an incredible number of seeds that are scattered far and wide. It is these seeds, tiny, hard, and almost perfectly spherical, that hold the plant's power. Crush one of these tiny seeds, and you unlock its fiery spirit. An enzyme within the seed cells called myrosinase is suddenly mixed with a compound called a glucosinolate. This chemical reaction produces isothiocyanates, the pungent, spicy molecules that give mustard its characteristic heat. It is a defense mechanism, a blast of chemical warfare designed to deter any insect or herbivore that would try to eat it. This tiny dormant sphere holds within it a sleeping fire, a potential for pungency that is startling in its intensity. In folk medicine, this fire was harnessed. Mustard plasters, a paste of ground mustard seed spread on a cloth, were applied to the chest to treat congestion or to aching joints to soothe pain. The fiery compounds would irritate the skin, increasing blood flow to the area in a process called counter-irritation. It was thought to draw the sickness out, to fight cold and stagnation with heat and stimulation. It was a plant of action, of fire, of fierce and focused energy, but its role in fighting the undead had nothing to do with its fire. It came from a curious piece of folklore, a belief about the very psychology of evil. It was widely held that vampires, and indeed many other kinds of evil spirits and demons, suffered from a peculiar affliction, erythromania, the compulsive need to count. If confronted with a large number of scattered items, grains of rice, seeds, knots in a rope, they would be irresistibly compelled to stop what they were doing and count each and every one. And what better object for this purpose than the mustard seed? It is tiny. It is numerous. A single handful contains thousands. A whole bagful, an astronomical number. The strategy was simple and brilliant. To protect a home, one would scatter mustard seeds on the roof or across the threshold. The approaching vampire, intent on its malevolent purpose, would be stopped in its tracks. It would be forced by the strange laws of its own cursed nature to begin counting. 1, 2, 3. The tiny rolling spheres an impossible and frustrating task. Its monstrous hunger would be subverted by this obsessive compulsive need, and it would be trapped there, counting, until the first light of dawn, the one thing it truly feared, came to cleanse the world and end its pathetic obsessive task. This same principle was applied to the grave. Scattering mustard seeds over the coffin or the burial mound ensured that if the dead should attempt to rise, its very first act would be to start counting the seeds that surrounded it, an impossible task that would keep it occupied and earthbound. This is a defense of immense creativity. It doesn't meet force with force. It doesn't rely on sacredness. It exploits a perceived flaw in the enemy's own mind. It is a form of intellectual warfare, a psychological trap. It is a victory for the small, the numerous, the granular. A single powerful predator is defeated by a multitude of tiny, insignificant things. There is a deep and satisfying symbolism in this. The great evil is not felled by a great hero, but is simply distracted, overwhelmed by the mundane complexity of the world. Think of the contrast. The hawthorn stake is an act of violent, righteous finality. The rowan branch is a totem of unwavering sacred power. And the mustard seed is a prank, a cosmic joke played upon the Lord of the Undead. It reduces the figure of ultimate terror to a pathetic creature, stuck on a rooftop, muttering numbers to itself as the sun rises. It is a defense born not just of fear, but of a certain defiant wit. So we have them, these four great rivals, the hawthorn, a living fortress offering a defense of wood and thorn, a brutal physical shield. The wild rose, a beautiful entanglement, a net of thorns and purity to trap and hold the unholy. The rowan, a sacred sentinel, its power innate and absolute, a spiritual ward against the darkness. And the mustard seed, a clever trick, a mathematical puzzle to ensnare the monster's mind. Each of these plants tells us something about how people saw the world and how they saw the nature of evil. They found in the forest and the field a reflection of their own fears and their own hopes for protection. They saw the hawthorn's impenetrable thicket and thought, "This can keep me safe." They saw the rose's clinging thorns and thought, "This can hold evil back." They felt the quiet presence of the rowan on a lonely mountain and thought, "This is a holy place." They saw the countless tiny mustard seeds and thought, even something small and numerous can defeat something large and singular. They were using the language of the natural world to write spells of protection. They were borrowing the genius of plants, their armor, their resilience, their chemistry, their very being, and weaving it into a tapestry of belief that gave them courage through the long dark nights. For every type of threat they could imagine, they found a plant that seemed to offer the perfect counter-strategy. And yet, for all their power, for all their deep roots in the soil of folklore, none of these would become the one true, undisputed champion in the story that was to come. The hawthorn, the rose, the rowan, the mustard seed, they would all eventually be relegated to supporting roles. Another plant, with a scent far more pungent than the hawthorn's bloom, and a fire more potent than mustard seed, was waiting in the kitchen garden, in the farmer's field. A plant whose power was not just in its form or its folklore, but in the very chemistry of its soul. The stage was set for the entrance of the one true Bane, the plant that would become so intertwined with the legend of the vampire that to this day it is impossible to imagine one without the other. Chapter 3. The Stinking Rose, a Natural History of Allium Sativum. And so we arrive, not in a thorny thicket, or beneath a flowering tree in a lonely churchyard, but in a humble patch of earth, a kitchen garden perhaps, or a sun-drenched field stretching across a valley floor. And we are greeted first, not by a sight, but by a smell, a scent that is a declaration. It is pungent, assertive, and utterly unmistakable. It is the earthy, fiery, and deeply savory perfume of garlic. This is our plant. Allium sativum, the humble bulb that through a remarkable alchemy of botany and human belief would become the ultimate shield against the creatures of the night. But before it ever faced a phantom, it had to face the very real challenges of its own world. Its story begins long before any folklore on the windswept plains of Central Asia. Let's travel there, in our minds. Picture a landscape of vast, open steppes, where the wind is a constant companion and the sun is relentless in the summer, the cold unforgiving in the winter. This is a tough neighborhood for a plant. The soil is not always rich, water is not always plentiful, and most importantly, everything is hungry. Grazing animals, burrowing insects, and microscopic pathogens in the soil are all looking for a meal. To survive here, a plant needs a strategy. It needs a fortress. And the wild ancestor of garlic, a plant we believe to be Allium longicuspis, built one of the most ingenious fortresses in the entire plant kingdom. It did not grow tall and thorny, or develop a bitter, inedible leaf. Instead, it invested all of its energy downward into the earth. It began to store its life force, its precious sugars and starches, in a tightly packed subterranean treasure chest. This treasure chest is the bulb, but it is not just a simple storage unit. It is a masterpiece of defensive architecture. Let's shrink down and run our hands over the outer surface of a garlic bulb. That dry, papery covering is called the tunic. It feels as delicate as old parchment, rustling quietly as you handle it. It seems fragile, but it is the first line of defense. It is a waterproof, breathable barrier that keeps the delicate interior safe from rot and dehydration. It is the castle wall, unassuming but effective. Now let's peel back that paper skin. Beneath it, we don't find a single solid object. We find a family, a collection of individual cloves, all huddled together, each wrapped in its own slightly more delicate paper shirt, and all attached to a solid flat base plate at the bottom. This is where the roots once grew, anchoring the entire structure in the soil. Each of these cloves is, botanically speaking, a highly modified leaf. It is a storage leaf, swollen with all the food the plant will need to survive the harsh winter and burst forth with new life in the spring. This is an act of incredible foresight. The plant is essentially packing a lunch for a future version of itself. It is a living battery, charged and waiting for the right moment. The brilliant efficiency of this design is why humans were so drawn to it. Here was a plant that could be harvested, stored for months in a cool, dark place, and still remain perfectly viable, a little packet of life and flavor waiting through the leanest months of the year. But the true genius of garlic, the secret weapon that makes it so formidable, is not visible. It is chemical. It is a defense system so elegant and so devastatingly effective that it operates on the level of cellular machinery. It is a form of biological warfare, perfected over millions of years of evolution. Inside the cells of a garlic clove, everything is peaceful. The plant stores a harmless, unassuming compound called allium. It is a sulfur-containing molecule, just sitting there, perfectly stable, causing no trouble at all. In a completely separate compartment within the same cell, like a tiny vial stored in a different room, the plant keeps an enzyme called alliinase. An enzyme is a biological catalyst, a little protein machine designed to start a chemical reaction. As long as the cell walls are intact, the alliin and the alliinase never meet. They are neighbors who live on the same street their entire lives, but never speak to one another. But the moment the wall is broken, the moment a digging rodent bites down, the moment an insect larva chews through, the moment a human tooth crushes the clove or a knife blade slices it, the piece is shattered. The compartments rupture. The allian and the allians are suddenly thrown together in the chaos, and when they meet, the reaction is instantaneous and explosive on a molecular scale. The alliinase enzyme immediately begins to dismantle the alline molecule, converting it into a new, highly volatile and incredibly aggressive substance. This new substance is called allicin, and allicin is the source of everything we associate with garlic. It is responsible for the fiery sting on the tongue, the sharp, almost metallic aroma that fills a kitchen, and most importantly for the plant, it is a powerful biocide. It is nature's own broad-spectrum antibiotic and antifungal agent. To a microbe or a small pest, allicin is a chemical weapon. It attacks them on a cellular level, disrupting their essential functions and creating an environment so hostile that they cannot survive. This is why garlic has such a profound resistance to rot and pests. It doesn't just sit there and take the damage, it fights back. It answers any physical assault with an immediate and potent chemical counter-assault. Think of it like a two-part epoxy. The two components are stable and inert on their own, but the moment you mix them, they form a powerful new substance. Garlic's defense is a binary weapon, armed only at the moment of attack. It is a system of such brilliance that the plant wastes no energy maintaining a constant state of toxicity. It only becomes toxic precisely when and where it is needed. This is the source of its power. This is the fire that early humans would come to both fear and revere. And humans did notice. Long before we understood the chemistry, we understood the results. Early hunter-gatherers, foraging on the Asian steppes, would have quickly learned that this pungent bulb was not only edible, but also remarkably resistant to spoilage. It was a reliable source of food and flavor, and as humans transitioned from nomadic life to agriculture, garlic was one of the first wild plants to be brought into the fold. It was an obvious candidate for domestication. It was easy to grow, easy to store, and its powerful chemistry meant it protected itself. We can trace this partnership back to the very dawn of civilization. Garlic was not just a food, it was a form of currency, a medicine, and a symbol of strength. Let's travel now to ancient Egypt, to the sun-baked plains of Giza. The air is thick with dust, and the sound of thousands of workers quarrying and hauling the immense limestone blocks that will form the Great Pyramids. Medical papyri from the time, like the famous Ebers papyrus dating back to 1550 BC, list garlic in over 20 different remedies, but its use was far more commonplace than that. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote that the Egyptian authorities spent vast sums of money to supply the pyramid builders with a daily ration of garlic, onions, and radishes. This wasn't just for flavor. They knew, with the kind of empirical wisdom that comes from generations of observation, that this potent bulb kept their workforce healthy. In these crowded, grueling conditions, disease could spread like wildfire. Garlic was their preventative medicine. It was an antiseptic, an immune booster, a way to maintain the stamina and strength of the thousands of laborers undertaking one of the greatest engineering projects in human history. They were paying their workers in health, in resilience, and the currency they used was Allium Sativum. They were building monuments to last an eternity, fueled by a plant whose own survival strategy was a monument to evolutionary engineering. From Egypt, garlic's reputation spread like creeping roots throughout the ancient world. It marched with the Roman legions, who consumed it in great quantities before battle. They believed it imparted courage and strength, and they would plant it in the fields of their conquered provinces, leaving a trail of garlic that reshaped the culinary and medicinal landscape of Europe. Pliny the Elder, the great Roman naturalist, catalogued dozens of medicinal uses for garlic, prescribing it for everything from snake bites and respiratory problems to epilepsy and digestive ailments. For the Romans, garlic was a panacea, a cure-all, a gift from the earth that was as essential to their toolkit as their swords and their aqueducts. In ancient Greece, it was associated with the darker, more primal forces. It was placed at crossroads as an offering to the goddess Hecate, a deity of witchcraft and the underworld. Athletes would chew it before competing in the Olympic Games for a burst of energy, and midwives used it to aid in difficult births. There was a sense that the plant's fiery spirit, its tangible power, could be harnessed for almost any purpose, whether to build up the body or to ward off unseen evils, and as it spread, it adapted. Farmers, from the Nile Delta to the Italian countryside, became garlic's evolutionary partners. They would select for the largest bulbs, the most robust cloves, the best keepers. Through centuries of careful cultivation, the wild, somewhat scraggly Allium longicuspis was slowly sculpted by human hands into the plump, familiar Allium sativum we know today. We created countless varieties, hard necks and soft necks, purple stripes and brilliant white silver skins, each adapted to its local climate and cuisine. We took this wild, fiery plant and invited it into our homes, making it an indispensable part of our lives. Its medicinal career continued unabated through the Middle Ages and into the modern era. It was a staple of the apothecary's garden. During outbreaks of plague, desperate people would wear garlands of garlic or chew the cloves, hoping its pungent aura would form a protective shield against the bad air they believed carried the disease. While they didn't understand germ theory, their instincts were not entirely wrong. Allicin and other sulfur compounds in garlic do have potent antimicrobial properties. They were fighting a microscopic enemy with a microscopic weapon without ever knowing it. In the monasteries of medieval Europe, where ancient medical knowledge was preserved and practiced, monks would meticulously cultivate garlic. They used it to make syrups for coughs, poultices for wounds, and tinctures for digestive complaints. They were carrying on the traditions of Pliny and the Egyptian physicians, using the plant as a reliable front-line defense against the ailments of their communities. It was cheap, it was abundant, and it worked. This reputation as a powerful healer reached a remarkable peak during the First World War. Before the widespread availability of penicillin, battlefield infections were one of the greatest threats to wounded soldiers. A simple shrapnel wound could easily become a fatal case of gangrene. Medical supplies were stretched thin, and doctors on the front lines turned to what they had. They began using garlic. They would use sterilized moss called sphagnum moss, which is highly absorbent, soak it in garlic juice, and pack wounds with it. The sulfur compounds in the garlic acted as a powerful antiseptic, killing bacteria and preventing infection. In the trenches of Europe, the stinking rose, as it was sometimes called, was saving lives. Its ancient role as a protector was being played out in one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. Let's pause and consider this journey. From a wild plant defending itself against insects on a vast empty steppe, to a ration for the builders of pyramids, a source of courage for Roman soldiers, an offering to a Greek goddess, a monk's remedy, and a battlefield antiseptic. Long before a single vampire was ever imagined, garlic had already established itself in the human psyche as a substance of immense power. It was not a supernatural power, but a tangible chemical one, a power you could smell on the air, taste on your tongue, and feel in your own body. It had a reputation for cleansing, for purifying, for driving out sickness. Its heat was seen as a force for good, a fire that could burn away corruption. It was a protector, a guardian, a small, unassuming bulb that held within its paper walls a chemical arsenal of incredible sophistication. It didn't need folklore to make it seem magical. Its real-world properties were magical enough. Every time we slice a clove of garlic in our kitchen, and that sharp, wonderful scent rises up to meet us, we are reenacting the very event that is the source of its power. We are for a moment the predator, breaking the cell walls, and the garlic is responding, as it always has, by releasing its fiery spirit. We have simply learned to love the very thing it evolved to use as a weapon. We have taken its chemical shield and turned it into a spice, its battle cry into a perfume. This is the plant that was waiting in the wings of history. Not a passive symbol, but an active participant. A plant whose very soul was defined by a potent protective chemistry. It had already proven itself 1,000 times over as a guardian of health, a vanquisher of invisible evils, and a source of enduring strength. All it needed now was an enemy worthy of its reputation. It needed a monster, born of shadow and fear, to step into the light. The stage was perfectly set. The world's most famous protector was about to meet the world's most famous predator. Chapter 4. The Miasma and the Monster. From Plague Ward to Vampire Shield. And so it waited. This small, unassuming bulb, a vessel of potent chemistry, sat at the center of human civilization, a silent guardian against the invisible. It had earned its reputation in kitchens and apothecaries, a protector of the living. But the monster it was destined to face was not one that could be fought with swords or shields. It wouldn't announce itself with a roar or the clash of steel. This predator was silent, it was patient, and it was already everywhere. It was the deepest and most primal of all human fears, the fear of a sickness that came in the night, a pestilence that could sweep through a town like a phantom, leaving grief and questions in its wake. Before we understood the intricate dance of microbes, of viruses and bacteria, the world must have felt profoundly, terrifyingly random. Imagine, just for a moment, living in a time when a fever could be a death sentence, when a cough in the marketplace could signal the beginning of the end for a family, for a whole village. Sickness was not a diagnosis, it was a curse. It was a malevolent presence, an ill wind, a a punishment from a displeased heaven. And to fight it, you had to understand it, or at least you had to believe you understood it. For centuries, the most compelling, the most logical explanation was the theory of miasma. The word itself feels ancient on the tongue, a whisper of old fears. It comes from the Greek for pollution, and that is exactly what people believed it was. The theory held that diseases like cholera, the plague, and countless other fevers were spread not by contact, not by water, but by a noxious form of bad air. This miasma was thought to emanate from rotting organic matter, from swamps, from graveyards, from the filth that accumulated in the crowded, unsanitary streets of growing cities. It was a truly sensory theory of medicine. If it smelled bad, it was bad for you. Rot and decay produced a foul odor, and rot and decay were associated with death. Therefore, the smell itself must be the carrier of the sickness. It's easy for us to dismiss this now, armed with our electron microscopes and our knowledge of the germ world. But place yourself in that mindset. It was an elegant and internally consistent explanation for a chaotic world. Why did disease flourish in the dirtiest, most crowded parts of a city? The miasma was thickest there. Why did epidemics often worsen in the heat of summer? The sun baked the filth, releasing more of the poisonous air. It was a theory born of direct observation, and it gave humanity something it desperately needed, a measure of control. If the enemy was bad air, then the solution was good air, or at the very least, a way to fight the bad air. And so people carried pomanders, small metal balls filled with sweet-smelling herbs like lavender and rose petals, holding them to their noses when walking through a foul-smelling street. They burned juniper and rosemary in their homes, believing the fragrant smoke would purify the air, scrubbing it clean of the invisible pestilence. Physicians, during the Great Plagues, would wear their famous beaked masks, the tips of which were stuffed with aromatic herbs and spices. They were not trying to filter microbes, they were creating a personal bubble of what they believed to be safe, clean air, a barrier against the deadly miasma. In this world, in this theatre of scent, what role could garlic possibly play? It was not sweet like lavender or woody like rosemary. Its scent was not gentle or pleasing. It was pungent. It was aggressive. It was a force, and that was its power. If miasma was a foul, clinging presence in the air, then garlic was its opposite. Its sharp, sulfuric, almost metallic scent wasn't meant to mask the stench of decay. It was meant to annihilate it. To crush a clove of garlic is to release a chemical shout, a potent volley of sulfur compounds that don't just occupy the air but conquer it. It was seen as the ultimate purifier, a fumigant so powerful it could drive out not just the smell of sickness but the very essence of it. People would hang braids of garlic in their windows and over their doors, not merely as decoration but as a kind of atmospheric shield. It was a declaration to the unseen world. This house is protected. The air within is clean and strong. The miasma of the plague will find no purchase here. They would rub it on their skin, chew it raw, hoping to inoculate themselves from the inside out, to make their very bodies inhospitable to the bad air. Garlic wasn't just a remedy. It was a weapon in an unending war against an invisible airborne enemy. It was the guardian of the threshold, the protector of the breath. But the fear of the plague, the terror of the miasma, did not end with the final breath. In many ways, that is where the deeper, more complex fear began. Because the miasma theory had a dark and terrible corollary. If the source of the foul, disease-carrying air was decay, then the most potent source of all was the decaying human body itself. The graveyard became a place of profound dread, not just for its emotional weight of loss, but as a potential source of future sickness, a place where the earth itself could be breathing out pestilence. And when a plague tore through a community, it left behind a landscape of questions that grief alone could not answer. Why did it seem to take a whole family, one by one? Why, weeks after the first death, would others in the household begin to sicken and die? To us, the answer is tragic but simple: contagion. The bacterium Yersinia pestis, or other pathogens passing from person to person through proximity, through fleas, through the shared air of a small home. But without that knowledge, another, more sinister pattern began to emerge in the minds of the terrified survivors. It seemed as though the first to die was not truly gone. It seemed as though they were somehow still active, reaching out from the grave to pull their loved ones in with them. This is the moment, the critical turning point, where a real-world tragedy, interpreted through the lens of folklore and fear, begins to birth a monster. Let's walk through the process, not as a horror story, but as a sad and understandable series of misinterpretations. Imagine a small, isolated village in Eastern Europe centuries ago. A sickness, swift and brutal, has swept through. A man, let's call him Stefan, is the first to die. He is buried quickly, as is the custom during an epidemic, to prevent the spread of the miasma. But a week later, his wife falls ill with the same symptoms. Then his son. The neighbors whisper. They are afraid. They begin to believe that Stefan is not resting peacefully. They believe he is a revenant, one of the walking dead, and that he is draining the life from his family to sustain his own unnatural existence. Driven by terror and a desperate need to stop the sickness, the villagers decide to act. They gather at the cemetery, shovels in hand, to exhume the body. They are not scientists. They are not coroners. They are frightened, grieving people looking for proof of something monstrous. And because of the natural biological processes of decomposition, they will find exactly what they are looking for. They open the coffin. What they expect to see, what we might expect to see, is a pale, still, gaunt figure. But that is not what greets them. The body of Stefan appears, surprisingly healthy. His abdomen is swollen, distended, as if he has recently had a large meal. His cheeks, which were sunken in sickness, now seem fuller, plumper. He does not look starved by death. He looks fed. This observation is their first piece of evidence. But it is a complete misunderstanding of biology. After death, the bacteria that live within our digestive tract, the very same bacteria that helped us digest food in life, do not simply die. They are in fact presented with a feast. Unchecked by a living immune system, they begin to break down the body's internal tissues, and in the process, they release gases, methane, hydrogen sulfide, carbon dioxide. These gases accumulate, primarily in the abdominal cavity, causing the body to bloat. It is a simple, natural process, a final exhalation of internal chemistry. But to the terrified villagers, the conclusion is immediate and inescapable. Stefan has been feeding. They look closer. They see a dark, reddish-brown substance staining his lips and chin, trickling from the corner of his mouth and from his nose. It looks to their horrified eyes exactly like blood. Fresh blood. The blood of his wife, of his son. This is their second and most damning piece of evidence. But again, it is a trick of biology. As the internal organs decompose under the pressure of the bloating gases, their structures break down. The lungs in particular become filled with a dark, blood-tinged fluid. The pressure from the abdomen can force this fluid up the trachea, out of the mouth and nose. This process, known clinically as purging, produces a liquid that is not living blood, but a grim effluent of decay. To the villagers, however, the meaning is clear. Not only has he fed, but he has fed messily, greedily. He is a monster. Trembling, they inspect his face further. They notice that his teeth seem longer, more prominent than they were in life. His fingernails, too, seem to have grown, appearing like sharp, yellowed claws. Surely this is a sign of continued unnatural life. But this, too, is an illusion. The teeth and nails do not actually grow after death. What happens is that the skin, as it dehydrates and loses its elasticity, begins to retract. The gums pull back, exposing more of the tooth that was previously hidden. The skin of the fingertips recedes, revealing more of the nail bed. It is not growth but subtraction. It is the gentle shrinking of the mortal frame. But in the flickering torchlight of a midnight exhumation, it looks like the sprouting of fangs and claws. There are other signs too. The skin, instead of being uniformly pale, may have dark purplish patches where the blood has settled due to gravity, a process called livor mortis. To the villagers, these look like bruises, perhaps from a struggle with one of his victims. If they are brave or foolish enough to move the body, they may hear a soft groan or a sigh escape its lips. This sound, which would send anyone fleeing in terror, is simply trapped gas being forced out of the lungs as the torso is compressed. It is the last passive whisper of the body's internal atmosphere, nothing more. Every single one of these signs, the bloating, the purge fluid, the seemingly longer teeth and nails, the skin discoloration, the escaping gases, are the predictable, universal, and entirely natural stages of a human body returning to the earth. It is nature's quiet, methodical process of disassembly, of recycling. But for the pre-scientific mind, for people steeped in folklore and gripped by the fear of a deadly plague, these signs do not spell decomposition, they spell vampire. They have found their monster. They have confirmed their darkest fears. The sickness is not a random misfortune. It is a deliberate, malicious act, perpetrated by one of their own from beyond the grave. And now, how do you fight such a creature? How do you protect yourself from a neighbor who will not stay dead? You turn to the most powerful protector you know. You turn to the guardian that has already been hanging over your door, shielding you from the invisible evil in the air. You turn to garlic. The logic flows perfectly. Garlic's power was in its pungency, its ability to drive away the bad air, the miasma that was believed to cause the plague. The creature in the grave is the ultimate source of that plague, the very engine of the miasma. Therefore, garlic must be uniquely terrifying to it. The plant's role begins to transform. It is no longer just a passive atmospheric shield, it becomes an active weapon. The villagers don't just hang it on their doors anymore. They stuff cloves of it into the mouth of the corpse to prevent it from groaning, or perhaps from biting. They place it in the coffin, packing it around the body to purify its corrupting influence. They rub the juice on their window frames and door sills, creating a magical barrier that the creature cannot cross. They wear it around their necks, a personal amulet, its scent a constant pungent reminder of its protective power. Notice the beautiful, tragic, and entirely logical transfer of power. Garlic was first used as a fumigant to protect the living from the cause of the disease, the miasma. Now it is used as an amulet to protect the living from the perceived source of the disease, the undead. The plant that guarded you from the invisible breath of pestilence now guards you from the physical body of the monster born from that pestilence. It is a perfect metaphorical circle. The association becomes unbreakable, forged in the crucible of fear and death. Over generations, as the stories are told and retold, the original reasoning, the connection to miasma begins to fade. People may forget why it works, only that it does. The story simplifies, becomes more potent. It's no longer garlic's powerful, purifying scent overwhelms the deathly miasma upon which the revenant depends. It is simply, garlic repels vampires. The scientific, or rather the pseudo-scientific, has become the supernatural, and the plant itself takes on a new character. It is no longer just a healthy food or a folk remedy. It is a holy object, a piece of supernatural technology. Its white, pure cloves are seen as an emblem of good, a stark contrast to the dark earth of the grave. Its sharp, burning taste is the fire of life, anathema to the cold of death. The layers of papery skin that must be peeled away to reach the clove are like protective enchantments that must be undone. Every aspect of the plant is reinterpreted through this new mythic lens. What we are witnessing is the birth of a legend, not from whole cloth, but from the careful, terrified stitching together of observable facts. The vampire myth is not just a fantasy, it is a ghost story told by biology. It is the result of the human mind desperately trying to create a narrative, to find an antagonist for the faceless, silent horror of epidemic disease. The monster gave them something to fight, something to blame, something to ward off. And in that fight, garlic, the ancient guardian, the vanquisher of invisible evils, was the only logical choice for a weapon. It had been selected for this role by centuries of use, by its unique and powerful chemistry, and by its reputation as a protector of life. The stage, which we saw being set at the end of our last exploration, is now fully occupied. The protector has met the predator, but the predator was never a caped aristocrat from Transylvania. The predator was Yersinia pestis. The predator was cholera. The predator was the profound and terrible mystery of death itself. And garlic, the humble bulb, stood firm against it all, first as medicine and then as myth. It made the transition from the apothecary's shelf to the pages of folklore, its pungent soul becoming the stuff of legend, a shield for the living in a world haunted by the dead. Chapter 5. Stoker's Prescription, the Canonization of a Weakness. And so it became a shield for the living, in a world haunted by the dead. But a shield, in the realm of folklore, can be many things. It can be a sprig of hawthorn, a branch of wild rose, or the heavy silver of a crucifix. It can be the simple act of crossing running water, or the refusal to invite a dark stranger across the threshold of your home. The armory of folk magic is vast, cluttered with the hopes and fears of 1,000 villages, each with its own preferred defense against the shadows. For centuries, garlic was simply one weapon among many, a trusted blade in a room full of them. But it was not yet the definitive article. It was not the one thing, the final answer. For that to happen, the scattered whispers of folklore needed a librarian. They needed a curator, someone to walk through the crowded aisles of superstition, to study each charm and weigh its power, not with the scales of magic, but with the careful, considered judgment of a master storyteller. The world of myth needed an editor, and it found him in a softly spoken Dublin-born theatre manager living in London, a man named Bram Stoker. It is here, in the gaslit world of the late 19th century, that the story of garlic takes a profound turn. It migrates from the damp earth of the garden and the dusty pages of the herbalist's manual into the ink and paper of what would become one of the most influential novels ever written. Before 1897, the vampire was a mutable, shadowy thing, a bloated, shambling peasant corpse in Slavic tales, a beautiful and predatory aristocrat in the penny dreadfuls. Its weaknesses were just as varied. But after Bram Stoker's Dracula was published, the mythology began to crystallize, to harden into a set of rules as rigid and inescapable as any law of physics. And at the very heart of that new canon, pungent and undeniable, was the humble clove of garlic. Stoker did not invent the connection between vampires and garlic. That root was already deep in the soil of Eastern European folklore. What he did was something far more powerful. He took that folk belief, that rustic superstition, and he placed it in the hands of a man of science. He codified it, prescribed it, and through the sheer narrative force of his story, he elevated it from one of many defenses to the ultimate defense. He gave the superstition a methodology, a voice of authority, and in doing so he made it immortal. To understand how he accomplished this, we have to become literary archaeologists. We have to gently blow the dust off his research, look over his shoulder as he sits at his desk, and see the raw materials he was working with. Stoker was a meticulous man, a manager by trade, and he did not build his nightmare world from whole cloth. He built it from research, from travelogues, from history books, and from ethnographic accounts of the very lands he intended to use as his setting. And one book, more than any other, seems to have served as his primary guide to the folklore of the region he would make so famous. It was a book published in 1888, written by a Scottish woman named Emily Gerard, titled The Land Beyond the Forest, Facts, Figures and Fancies from Transylvania. Let's just pause and feel the weight of that. This wasn't a grimoire of ancient spells. It was, for all intents and purposes, a piece of travel journalism, a Victorian lady's account of her time in a remote, and to the British reader, deeply exotic part of the world. Gerard was married to an Austro-Hungarian cavalry officer, and for 2 years she lived in Sibiu and Brasov, the heart of Transylvania. She was an astute observer, a woman fascinated by the customs, the clothes, the food, and, most importantly, the superstitions of the people she lived amongst. And in her chapter on Transylvanian superstitions, she gives Stoker the very seed of his monster. She describes the belief in the Nosferatu, the undead. She writes, and you can almost hear the scratch of Stoker's pen as he copies the notes, that the Nosferatu is held in such dread by the Romanian peasant that it is scarcely possible to persuade one of them to pronounce the word. She details the belief that those who commit suicide, or are the victims of a vampire, are doomed to become one themselves. But crucially, she also documents the defenses. She speaks of the stake, made of ash or aspen, driven through the heart of the corpse to pin it to its grave. And then she mentions our plant. Her description is almost offhand, a simple observation of folk practice. She notes that on the eve of St. George's Day, a night when all evil things are believed to be at their most powerful, the peasants would rub garlic on the windows and doors of their houses and on the horns of their cattle to protect them from witches and evil spirits. And she adds a chillingly specific detail. The Romanians, she writes, have a singular belief that every person killed by a Nosferatu becomes likewise a vampire after death and will continue to suck the blood of other innocent persons till the spirit has been exorcised, either by opening the grave of the suspected person and driving a stake through the corpse, or by firing a pistol shot into the coffin. In very obstinate cases, she continues, it is recommended to cut off the head and replace it in the coffin with the mouth filled with garlic. There it is, not just a repellent for generalized evil, but a specific tool to be used against this particular creature, a way to silence the undead, to pack its profane mouth with the pungent power of the earth. It is a detail so visceral, so strangely practical in its gruesomeness, that you can see why it would lodge itself in a novelist's mind. But even in Gerard's work, it is one detail among several. She gives equal weight to the stake, to the decapitation. She also mentions the power of wild rose. Garlic is present, it is potent, but it is not yet the star of the show. It is part of an ensemble cast of apotropaics. Stoker, the masterful curator, saw something special in it. While he would incorporate nearly all of Gerard's details, the stake, the beheading, the power of sacred objects, he made a conscious choice to elevate garlic. He saw its narrative potential, and to understand that choice, we must leave his library and open the pages of his novel. We must trace every mention of the plant, from the first time it appears as a confusing folk charm to the moment it becomes a doctor's solemn prescription. The journey begins with Jonathan Harker, the young pragmatic English solicitor travelling into the heart of a world still steeped in the old ways. He is a man of ledgers and timetables, a symbol of the modern, rational Victorian world. He is a man of ledgers and timetables, a symbol of the modern, rational Victorian world. And it is through his eyes that we first encounter the power of Allium Sativum. As he nears his destination, the kindness of the local people becomes intertwined with a fear they cannot or will not name. An old woman at an inn presses a crucifix upon him, her eyes wide with terror. Then, as he boards the final coach that will take him to the Borgo Pass, he notices something else. He sees his fellow passengers and the driver making the sign of the cross, and he smells a strange, pungent odour. He might not have even recognized it at first. A city man, unfamiliar with the daily scents of a rural kitchen, but the people around him are festooned with it. They are wearing it, they are carrying it, they are surrounded by an aura of garlic. Later, after his terrifying coach ride to the castle, as the Count himself prepares a meal for him, Harker notes a peculiar absence. He writes in his journal, "I may have been imagining it, but I fancied that there was a strange quiet about the place. I have not seen a servant anywhere, or heard a sound near the castle, except the howling of wolves. The salad was made by my host himself, and I confess I was not sorry for it, for he had no garlic in it." It's a subtle, almost throwaway line. A modern reader, already steeped in 100 years of vampire lore, understands the significance immediately. But for the reader in 1897, it is simply a strange culinary observation. Why would this English solicitor, likely accustomed to the much blander fare of his home country, Even notice the absence of garlic in a salad. Stoker is planting a seed. He is associating the Count, this charming yet unsettling nobleman, with an aversion to this common earthy plant. He is establishing a rule of his universe, quietly, in the background, long before he explains what it means. Garlic, at this point in the novel, is pure superstition. It is the practice of peasants, the stuff of old wives' tales. Harker, the modern man, is bewildered by it. He accepts the crucifix out of politeness, but he is a world away from understanding the deep, primal fear that motivates these people. The garlic is just a smell, a piece of local color. It has no power for him because he does not believe. For the power of garlic to be canonized, it needs a different kind of champion. It cannot remain in the hands of the frightened and superstitious. It needs an advocate who can bridge the gap between the ancient world of folklore and the modern world of science. It needs a professor. It needs Abraham Van Helsing. And it is with the tragic decline of Lucy Westenra that the novel and the mythology of the vampire truly pivots. When Lucy begins to sicken with her mysterious illness, the 2 tiny marks on her neck, the progressive inexplicable loss of blood, her fiancé Arthur Holmwood and her suitor, the brilliant psychiatrist Dr. John Seward, are helpless. They are men of modern science, and their science has failed them. They see the symptoms, but they cannot comprehend the cause. Their world of medicine, of logical diagnosis and treatment, has no framework for what is happening. And so they send for an expert, Seward's old mentor from Amsterdam, Professor Van Helsing. Van Helsing is one of literature's most brilliant creations precisely because he embodies the paradox that Stoker needs to make his story work. He is a doctor, a scientist, a philosopher, a man who speaks in the rational, sometimes convoluted language of the Victorian academic. But he also has, as he says, an absolutely open mind. He is willing to accept that there are things in the universe that cannot be explained by the textbooks in his library. He is the perfect bridge between the 2 worlds, the scientific and the supernatural. He is the man who can look at a folk remedy and see a medical necessity. When Van Helsing arrives and examines Lucy, he understands almost immediately what he is dealing with. But he cannot simply say, "She is being preyed upon by a vampire." To do so would be to invite ridicule from these modern, rational men. He would be dismissed as a madman. So he must work through other means. He must introduce his ancient cures under the guise of an unorthodox but still medical procedure. And his first prescription is not a drug, it is a flower. The scene is one of the most memorable in the entire novel. Van Helsing produces a great bundle, a wreath of garlic flowers. He doesn't just hand them to Dr. Seward, he performs a ritual. He instructs him with the gravity of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. He began to open his bag, Stoker writes, and took out of it a mass of what looked like common garlic flowers and blossoms. Seward, the conventional doctor, is baffled. "Oh, Professor," he says, "I cannot believe that there is any good in such a thing. These may be the beliefs of the peasants, but we are men of science." This is the critical moment. This is the conflict Stoker has been building towards. The old ways versus the new. Faith versus reason. And Van Helsing's response is the key that unlocks it all. He does not say, "You must believe in magic." Instead, he reframes the problem. He says, "You do not let your eyes see, nor your ears hear, and that which is outside your daily life is not of account to you. But I am not my own master in this. I must do what I can." He appeals not to superstition, but to his own authority as a greater, more experienced man of science. He is essentially saying, "Trust me, my science is bigger than your science," and then he proceeds with his work. It is described in meticulous, almost clinical detail. He took the flowers and began to fasten them in a great wreath round her neck. Then he took the flowers and rubbed them all over the sashes of the window and the door, round the framework and on the knots of the wood. This is not the panicked act of a superstitious peasant. This is a careful, methodical application. He is treating the room itself, creating a sterile field, an antiseptic barrier against an unseen contagion. The language is everything. He calls it a prophylactic, a medical term for a preventative measure. He is using the vocabulary of science to validate the rituals of folklore. The effect is immediate and powerful. The smell of the garlic fills the room, an earthy, pungent, life-affirming scent that stands in stark contrast to the cloying, deathly sweetness of the sick room. It is a sensory anchor. Stoker makes you smell it. He describes it as fetid, a strange word choice that suggests something so powerfully organic it is almost overwhelming. This is not the delicate scent of rose or hawthorn. This is an aggressive, invasive smell. It is a smell that claims territory. It does not ask for permission. It simply fills the space, pushing everything else out. It is the perfect sensory analog for a spiritual defense. It creates a border, a wall of scent that nothing foul can cross. The genius of Stoker's narrative is that he then immediately demonstrates the absolute unshakable power of this remedy by showing what happens when it is removed. Lucy, in a moment of sleepy confusion, feels stifled by the smell and begs her mother to open the window and remove the horrid, strong-smelling flowers. Her mother, ignorant of the desperate purpose behind the floral arrangement, complies. She clears the room of its pungent shield, and in doing so she unwittingly signs her daughter's death warrant. The moment the garlic is gone, the monster can enter, the barrier is breached, and the attack resumes, this time with fatal consequences. Stoker has just conducted a perfect literary experiment. He established a hypothesis: garlic repels the vampire. He performed the procedure. Van Helsing applied the garlic. He observed the positive result. Lucy was safe for a night. Then he introduced a control variable. The garlic was removed, and he recorded the devastating negative result. The vampire returned, and Lucy and her mother died. In the logical structure of the narrative, the conclusion is inescapable. The garlic works. It is not a belief, it is a fact, proven by empirical evidence within the world of the story. A superstition has been tested, validated, and passed through the rigorous methodology of a scientific mind. It has been canonized. From this point on in the novel, the power of garlic is an accepted law. It becomes part of the standard operating procedure for our band of vampire hunters. When the now undead Lucy rises from her tomb to prey on children, the men prepare to confront her, and Van Helsing, packing his bag for the night's gruesome work, lists his tools. He has a crucifix, a stake, a hammer, but he also has garlic. He uses it to seal the cracks of her tomb, to ensure she cannot return to it. He treats it as a piece of essential equipment, no different from the lantern or the shovel. Later, when Mina Harker herself falls under the Count's influence, the heroes again turn to their proven defenses. Van Helsing places a wreath of garlic around her neck, just as he did for Lucy. But this time they understand. There is no skepticism. There is only a desperate hope that the old medicine will work again. It becomes a symbol of their dwindling chances, a fragile, fragrant shield against an overwhelming darkness. Mina, brave and practical, accepts it without question. She is not suspicious of me, Van Helsing notes with relief, and proceeded to put the wreath of garlic round her neck. The patient is now complicit in her own folkloric treatment. She has accepted the new science. So we must return to our central question. Why? In a world of folklore filled with potent defenses, why did Bram Stoker choose to elevate Allium Sativum to this supreme position? Why not the wild rose with its thorns and its association with purity? Why not the hawthorn, a tree steeped in Celtic and European myth? He certainly uses these other elements. The crucifix is of course centrally important, representing the power of Christian faith against the demonic creature. But among the natural botanical defenses, garlic is given a special primary role. There are, I think, several interlocking reasons for this, and they reveal Stoker's brilliance not just as a horror writer, but as a deeply intuitive psychologist and symbolist. First, as we have already felt, is the immense sensory power of the plant. A novel is a world built of words, and a storyteller must use every tool available to make that world feel real. Sight and sound are the easiest to conjure, but smell is a deeper, more primal sense. To describe the smell of garlic is to invoke a powerful, immediate and very specific sensory memory in the reader. We all know what it smells like. We know how it lingers on the hands, how it fills a kitchen, how it can be both delicious and overpowering. By filling Lucy Westenra's room with that scent, Stoker makes the scene intensely physical. You are not just reading about a magical barrier, you are smelling it. It makes the supernatural tangible. The wild rose is beautiful, but its scent is delicate, fleeting. Garlic's scent is a declaration. It is a presence. It is a force. It does not suggest protection. It screams it. Second is the deep, almost archetypal symbolism of purity versus corruption that garlic carries. As we have explored for millennia, garlic has been seen as a purifier, a cleanser, a medicinal plant that drives out sickness. It is of the earth, a clean white bulb that grows in the dark soil. The vampire, in Stoker's conception, is the ultimate corruption. It is a being of decay, of pestilence, of tainted blood. The Count is constantly associated with foul smells, with the dust of tombs, the scent of the earth from his native land. He is a walking plague, a biological and spiritual contagion. What better weapon to use against such a creature than the ancient world's most famous antibiotic? It is a battle of symbols fought on the physical plane, the pure, pungent life force of the garlic bulb against the creeping, sweet-smelling death of the vampire. It's a perfect opposition. The garlic is a kind of spiritual bleach, scrubbing the world clean of the vampire's stain. Third, and perhaps most subtly, is the idea of domesticity and accessibility. A silver crucifix is a specialized object. A stake must be carved from a specific wood, but garlic is common. It is a kitchen staple. It is a food of the people. By making it the primary defense, Stoker brings the fight against the ultimate evil into the home. He democratizes it. The shield against the monster is not some rare herb found only on a remote mountaintop, nor is it an artifact locked in a church vault. It is right there, in your pantry. This is a profoundly terrifying and at the same time empowering idea. It means the monster can come to your very door, into your own bedroom. But it also means that you, the ordinary person, have the power to fight back. The battle can be waged not just by brave heroes and learned professors, but by anyone with a head of garlic. It grounds the epic struggle in the humble reality of daily life. Finally, we must consider the perspective of Stoker's late Victorian audience. For the English reader of 1897, garlic was still somewhat foreign. It was the scent of the continent, of Italy, of France, and most certainly of the mysterious, unmodern lands of Eastern Europe. It was not yet a staple of British cooking in the way it is today. Its very pungency was a mark of otherness. So in a wonderfully clever turn, Stoker uses one form of foreignness to combat another. The vampire is an ancient, aristocratic evil from the East, invading modern, rational London, and the antidote is an ancient peasant folk remedy, also from the East, prescribed by a Dutchman. The story becomes a clash of continental forces, played out in the drawing rooms and graveyards of England. The garlic reinforces the exotic, non-English nature of the entire supernatural conflict. Through this masterful combination of sensory detail, symbolic weight, narrative logic, and cultural resonance, Bram Stoker took a simple piece of folklore and transformed it. He didn't just tell us that garlic could repel a vampire. He showed us. He conducted the experiment on the page and made us, the readers, his witnesses. He had his most intelligent, most authoritative character, the scientist Van Helsing, explain its necessity. He made its presence a matter of life and its absence a matter of death. He wrote the rulebook for all who would follow. After Dracula, the connection was no longer a regional superstition. It was a fundamental law of supernatural horror. Every vampire story that followed, even those that sought to subvert the myths, had to contend with Stoker's prescription. They could honor it, they could mock it, they could try to explain it away with pseudoscience about allergies or blood properties, but they could not ignore it. The writer's pen had proven mightier than the peasant's tongue. The fictional doctor's word had become canonical gospel. Bram Stoker found the legend of garlic in a travelogue, a curious piece of local colour from a land beyond the forest. But by the time he was finished with it, he had planted it so deeply in our collective imagination that it is impossible to ever pull it out. He had made the humble bulb from the garden into a legend, a hero, the one true shield for the living in a world now haunted, forever, by his dead. Chapter 6. The Olfactory Uncanny. The science and psychology of scent as a weapon. And so, it was done. A simple plant, through the steady, quiet work of folklore and the masterstroke of a single author, became an immortal guardian. It is a story we all know, a piece of our shared cultural bedrock. But beneath the story, there is a deeper question, one that hums with a quiet scientific curiosity. Why this? Of all the things in a peasant's world, of all the symbols, the sounds, the textures, the tastes, why was a scent chosen to be the ultimate shield against the ultimate predator? Why does the idea of a powerful odor as a weapon against the unholy feel so right? It's a question that takes us away from the gaslit streets of Victorian London and the misty forests of Transylvania, and leads us instead into the far older, far stranger landscape of our own minds. It leads us down the quiet, intricate corridors of the human brain, to a place where our most modern fears are processed by our most ancient hardware. To understand why a smell can feel like a shield, we first have to understand what a smell truly is. When you hold a clove of garlic, what you are experiencing is not some vague ethereal essence. You are interacting with chemistry in its most intimate form. The plant is releasing tiny volatile molecules into the air, specifically a host of sulfur compounds, with the most famous being a molecule called allicin. These are not phantoms, they are physical objects, microscopic particles drifting on the currents of the air. They are little messengers, carrying a very specific chemical signature, and we in turn are exquisite receivers. Deep inside the winding, hidden passages of our nasal cavity lies a small patch of tissue called the olfactory epithelium. It is no bigger than a postage stamp, and yet it is one of a human's most miraculous pieces of biological engineering. This little patch is coated in a thin layer of mucus and studded with millions upon millions of specialized nerve cells, olfactory receptor neurons. Each one of these neurons is a lock waiting for a specific chemical key. When you breathe in, you pull those tiny molecules of allicin, those little messengers from the garlic clove, up into this hidden chamber. They dissolve into the mucus and find their way to the receptors. When a molecule of allicin, the key, finds its perfectly matched receptor neuron, the lock, it clicks, an electrical signal is born, a tiny spark of information, and here is where our sense of smell reveals its unique and ancient power. Here is where it diverges from every other sense we possess. When you see something, the light hits your retina, and the signal travels from your eye along the optic nerve. When you hear something, the sound waves are translated into signals in your inner ear. But both of these signals, along with those from touch and taste, must first make a stop. They are all routed through a central processing station in the brain called the thalamus. You can think of the thalamus as the brain's grand central switchboard operator. It takes in all the incoming sensory calls, sorts them, and directs them to the appropriate departments for higher processing in the cerebral cortex, the part of our brain responsible for conscious thought, for logic and reason. But smell is different. Smell gets a VIP pass. The signals from your olfactory receptors bypass the thalamus entirely. They travel along the olfactory nerve directly, immediately, to a structure called the olfactory bulb, which sits at the very front of the brain. And the olfactory bulb has a direct, unfiltered, private line to two of the most ancient and powerful parts of our entire nervous system, the amygdala and the hippocampus. To say that this connection is important is a profound understatement. The hippocampus is the master architect of our memory. It is the place where our experiences are catalogued, filed, and stored. The amygdala is the seat of our deepest emotions. It is the raw primal core of our brain that processes fear, aggression, pleasure, and anxiety. It is the ancient alarm system that has kept our species alive for hundreds of thousands of years. So while the sight of a wolf is being routed through the logical switchboard of the thalamus, signal from eyes appears to be a large canine, grey fur, sharp teeth, forwarding this to the visual cortex for analysis and also to the fear department. The scent of the wolf is already in the building. It has used a private entrance and is kicking down the door of the security office. Smell doesn't knock politely on the door of conscious thought. It triggers a feeling, a memory, a raw gut-level emotional response before you've even had a chance to fully process what you are smelling. This is why a particular scent can transport you back to your grandmother's kitchen with a clarity that no photograph ever could. The smell of old books, of rain on hot asphalt, of a hospital corridor. These don't just remind you of a place, they make you feel the way you felt in that place. It is a form of time travel, mediated by chemistry. The memory is not just recalled, it is relived, because the signal for the scent and the seat of the memory are immediate, intimate neighbors in the brain. And if a smell can be so deeply tied to memory and nostalgia, it is just as powerfully, if not more powerfully, tied to our most primal instinct, fear. The direct line from the nose to the amygdala is nature's early warning system. Long before our ancestors had sophisticated language or tools, they had their sense of smell to tell them what was safe and what was not. The sweet smell of ripe fruit meant nourishment. The clean scent of fresh water meant life. And the acrid, pungent smells, the smells of decay, of sickness, of predators, those smells meant danger. They meant run. This brings us to one of the most powerful and misunderstood of our basic emotions, disgust. We often think of disgust as a social or moral feeling, a response to something we find offensive, but its roots are far deeper and more practical. Disgust is, at its core, a survival mechanism. It is the guardian at the gates of your body. Its one and only job is to keep you from ingesting, touching, or getting too close to things that could make you sick or kill you. It is your behavioral immune system. And what is the primary cue for this ancient guardian? Scent. The smell of rotting meat, of feces, of stagnant water, of diseased tissue. These things are universally repulsive to humans. We recoil from them instinctively. That sharp crinkling of the nose, the involuntary gag reflex, that is not a learned behavior. That is a deeply programmed evolutionary inheritance. Our ancestors who were disgusted by the smell of decay were the ones who avoided cholera, dysentery, and botulism. They were the ones who lived to have children, and they passed that instinct on. We are the descendants of the disgusted. Now, let us return to our humble clove of garlic. Let's consider what it is, chemically. The potent, sharp, almost aggressive aroma comes from those sulfur compounds. Allicin itself is not just a molecule that happens to have a strong smell. It is a defense mechanism for the plant. When an insect or a fungus tries to attack the garlic bulb, the plant tissue is damaged, which triggers an enzymatic reaction that produces allicin. Allicin is a potent antimicrobial and antifungal agent. It is quite literally a form of chemical warfare on a microscopic scale. It is the plant's way of screaming chemically, "Stay away, I am poison to you." Our brain, with its ancient hardwired system of threat detection, doesn't necessarily distinguish between the subtleties of this is the smell of a microbe-killing plant compound and this is the smell of decay and danger. It simply registers the sheer chemical intensity. The pungency of garlic is so overwhelming, so sharp and penetrating, that it trips the same ancient wires that the scent of rot would. It activates the disgust response. It is a biochemical shout. On a deep, pre-conscious level, it feels like a warning. It feels like something that should be kept at a distance. The mythology of the vampire paints it as a creature of corruption, a being of the grave, a walking corpse, animated by a profane hunger. What is a corpse biologically? It is a vessel for decay. It is a breeding ground for bacteria and pathogens. The natural endpoint of a corpse is the smell of putrefaction, the very scent our disgust system is most finely tuned to reject. So, to present this creature of the night with a scent that is so powerfully, aggressively pungent, a scent that mimics the chemical signature of things that ward off decay, and whose intensity triggers our own innate repulsion, it feels poetically, biologically and neurologically perfect. You are fighting a creature of rot with the chemical essence of anti-rot. You are holding up a scent that screams life and danger, and purity, and stay back all at once. It is a fire alarm for the nose. A fire alarm is loud, jarring, and unpleasant. Its job is not to be subtle. Its job is to get your attention and provoke an immediate action to get out. The smell of garlic in this context functions in the same way. It is so sensorially overwhelming that it bypasses polite consideration and hits the amygdala with the force of an emergency broadcast. It doesn't suggest that the vampire leave, it commands it on a primal chemical level. But the science of this scented weapon goes even deeper than neurobiology and evolutionary instinct. It crosses over into the intricate, fascinating world of human psychology, ritual, and belief. Consider the nature of the threat. A vampire, a ghost, a demon. These are not physical foes you can fight with a sword or a fist. They are metaphysical threats. They are born of anxiety, of the fear of death, of the unknown that lurks in the darkness. How do you build a wall against a shadow? How do you create a shield against a nightmare? You cannot. Not in the physical world, but you can create a shield for the mind. And this is where the genius of using a powerful scent as a repellent truly shines. Belief is a powerful force, but it is an intangible one. It lives in the abstract world of thought and faith. To make it feel real, to make it strong enough to comfort us in the face of terror, we humans have always sought to anchor our beliefs in the physical world. We perform rituals. We carry talismans. We build shrines. We need something we can see, touch, or in this case smell. Hanging a braid of garlic on the door or rubbing it on the window frames is not just a superstitious gesture, it is an act of demarcation. It is the creation of a tangible sensory boundary. The world outside that door may hold unspeakable horrors, but the world inside is protected. And how do you know it's protected? Because you can smell it. The pungent, lingering aroma of the garlic creates an olfactory perimeter. It permeates the air within the home, a constant, low-level reminder that the shield is active. It transforms an abstract belief, I am safe from evil, into a persistent sensory experience. Every time you walk into the room, every time you take a breath, you receive a small chemical confirmation of your safety. You can smell the wards, the invisible is made perceptible. This creates what we might call a placebo of safety. In medicine, a placebo works because a person's belief in a treatment can create a real physiological effect. The mind, convinced of healing, can begin to heal the body. Here, the principle is the same, but it is applied to psychological security. The fear of the vampire is real, causing real anxiety, a real racing heart, real sleepless nights. The garlic, imbued with the power of belief and folklore, offers a cure, and the potent scent is the mechanism of delivery. It is the proof that the medicine is working. Think of it from the perspective of a terrified peasant in a small dark village surrounded by a vast and dangerous forest. Fear is a constant companion. The belief in the protective power of garlic gives them a sense of agency, a tool to fight back. The ritual of placing the garlic provides a moment of control in a world that feels chaotic, and the resulting scent that fills their small home is a constant, comforting presence. It is a companion in the dark. It is a chemical whisper in the air that says, "You are safe. The barrier holds. The monster cannot enter here." This feedback loop is incredibly powerful. The belief prompts the ritual. The ritual creates a sensory confirmation. The sensory confirmation reduces anxiety and strengthens the belief. It is a self-reinforcing cycle of psychological comfort. The scent doesn't just repel the monster, it soothes the mind of the person who fears the monster. And in a battle against a creature born of fear, Soothing the mind is perhaps the most powerful weapon of all. We see this pattern in human behavior everywhere. The burning of incense in a sacred temple doesn't just make the air smell pleasant, it creates a distinct sensory environment, signaling to the brain that this space is different, set apart from the ordinary world. It helps to induce a state of reverence and contemplation. The sharp, clean smell of an antiseptic in a hospital doesn't just kill germs, it communicates a message of sterility, safety, and scientific authority, which can be profoundly reassuring to a patient. Scent defines our spaces, and in doing so defines our state of mind within them. Garlic, in this legend, becomes the incense of the safe home. It sanctifies the space, not with a prayer, but with a pungent sulphurous cloud. It turns a simple cottage into a fortress, not with stone walls but with a wall of scent. And so we find that the legend is not so strange after all. It is built upon a foundation of profound biological and psychological truth. It harnesses the direct, unfiltered pathway from our nose to the oldest parts of our brain. It taps into our deep evolutionary revulsion to the smells of danger and decay, and it leverages our very human need for tangible symbols to give strength to our beliefs. It is a perfect weapon, not because it could actually harm a creature of the night, but because it so perfectly addresses the human fears that gave birth to that creature in the first place. The story of Dracula and his Kryptonite is a masterpiece of Gothic horror, but the reason it endures, the reason it feels so intuitively correct, is because Bram Stoker, perhaps without even knowing it, stumbled upon a fundamental truth of our own nature. He armed humanity not with silver or sunlight, but with a smell, a weapon that attacks the monster by calming the mind, a shield built not of steel but of molecules, memory, and the beautiful intricate wiring of the human brain. The uncanny power of the scent is, in the end, the deeply familiar power of our own biology. Chapter 7. A Century of Pungency. Garlic's enduring legacy in cinema and culture. The reason it endures, the reason it feels so intuitively correct, is because Bram Stoker, perhaps without even knowing it, stumbled upon a fundamental truth of our own nature. He armed humanity not with silver or sunlight, but with a smell, a weapon that attacks the monster by calming the mind, a shield built not of steel but of molecules, memory, and the beautiful intricate wiring of the human brain. The uncanny power of the scent is, in the end, the deeply familiar power of our own biology. And from that biological truth, that deep cellular memory, a story was planted. It was a story that would escape the printed page and find a new home in a medium made of light and shadow, a place where a simple, humble bulb could be projected 100 feet high, its symbolic power magnified for millions. Cinema, in its infancy, was a dream space, a flickering canvas where our deepest anxieties could be given a face. And when it came time to give a face to the ancient dread of the vampire, it was only natural that we would also give a face, or rather a form, to its most ancient and earthy antidote. The journey of garlic on screen is a quiet epic. It is the story of how a real-world plant, with its very real chemical properties, became a piece of shared cinematic language, a piece of visual shorthand that could, in a single shot, communicate safety, peasant wisdom, and the boundary between the wholesome world of the living and the sterile, predatory world of the undead. Let's travel back to the very beginning of the cinematic nightmare. The year is 1922. The film is F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu. It is a silent, skeletal poem of a film, a plague dream captured on brittle celluloid. Here the vampire, Count Orlok, is not a seductive aristocrat. He is pestilence itself. He is a walking disease, with the stiff, unnatural movements of a corpse animated by rot. He brings with him not just his coffins of native soil, but a tide of rats, a literal plague. And in a world stalked by a walking sickness, what is the defense? Murnau doesn't linger on a string of garlic. The film is more primal, more elemental than that. But the logic is already there, woven into the very fabric of the story. The townspeople are helpless against this supernatural contagion. The heroes turn to ancient books, to folklore, to remedies that defy the cold logic of the modern world. The antidote to Orlok's unnatural existence is a return to something fundamental, the purity of a loving heart, the cleansing light of the sun. While not explicitly Garlic, the film establishes the foundational conflict that Garlic would come to represent, the battle between natural wholesome life and a parasitic unnatural death. The seeds of the Garlic trope are sown here, in the rich dark soil of German expressionism. The idea that nature itself, in its purest forms, is anathema to the vampire. It would take another decade for the folklore to be spoken aloud, for the rules to be codified for a global audience. We travel now to 1931, to the sound stages of Universal Studios. Todd Browning is directing Dracula, and the Hungarian actor Bela Lugosi is stepping into the role, defining it for generations. This Dracula is different. He is suave, aristocratic, hypnotic. He moves through drawing rooms and opera houses, a predator cloaked in refinement. And with this new, more sophisticated monster comes a more sophisticated hunter, Professor Van Helsing. It is Van Helsing who becomes the voice of the old ways, the keeper of the forgotten knowledge. He opens his bag, and it's like a cabinet of folkloric curiosities. He speaks not of garlic, but of wolfsbane, aconitum, another real-world plant with a long and potent history in European folklore, known for its toxicity. He explains that the vampire is repelled by it. In that moment, a quiet contract is made with the audience. We are told, explicitly, that this creature of the night, for all its power, is subject to the laws of the old world, the world of plants and their mysterious properties. The humble herb is elevated to the level of a silver bullet or a sacred cross. It is the weapon of the naturalist, the botanist, the believer in the deep magic of the earth. The camera lingers on the sprig of wolfsbane placed by a sleeping woman's bed. It is a tiny, fragile shield, a few leaves and flowers standing guard against an immortal evil. It is a beautiful cinematic representation of a core human hope, that the greatest darkness can be held at bay by the simplest of things, that a little piece of the living, breathing world is all it takes to protect us from the dead one. And while the script said wolfsbane, the idea became interchangeable. In the public imagination, the concept of a vampire-repelling plant was now firmly established, and the most famous of them all, garlic, soon took its place. The black and white world of Universal gave us the rules, but it was the British studio Hammer Film Productions in the late 1950s and 60s that painted those rules in lavish, lurid colour. With Christopher Lee as a taller, more feral and ferocious Dracula, and Peter Cushing as his intellectual, determined nemesis Van Helsing, the battle became more visceral, more vibrant. And it is here, in the world of Hammer horror, that garlic truly comes into its own as a cinematic icon. In these films, you can almost smell the set. The world feels earthy, historical, tactile. The taverns are filled with wood smoke and fear, and hanging from the rafters, in thick braided ropes, are enormous bunches of garlic. It is no longer just a medicinal sprig on a nightstand, it is architecture. It is a fortress wall woven from bulbs. When a character hangs a wreath of garlic on their door, the camera treats it with the same reverence as a priest brandishing a crucifix. The effect is deeply sensory. The crisp white paper of the garlic cloves seems to glow in the warm candlelit interiors. It contrasts so perfectly with the deep reds of the vampire's cape lining, the spilled blood, the velvet curtains of the castle. It is the colour of life against the colour of death. It is the symbol of the peasant, the common person, a tool available to everyone. You don't need to be a priest or a nobleman to find a head of garlic. It is a democratic defense, a piece of folk wisdom that empowers the powerless. Hammer's filmmakers understood that horror is most effective when it provides small pockets of safety, islands of calm in a sea of terror, a locked door, a warm fire, and most potently, a room filled with the pungent protective aroma of garlic. The presence of the garlic makes the threat of the vampire outside feel all the more real. It is a shield, and the power of a shield is only meaningful if the sword is sharp. For a generation of filmgoers, the image of a beautiful woman, clad in a white nightgown, cowering in a room festooned with garlic as a shadow passes her window, became the quintessential image of Gothic horror. The plant was no longer just a prop, it was a central character in the drama of survival. But as with any idea that becomes so deeply embedded in our collective consciousness, it eventually becomes ripe for satire. Once a rule is universally understood, the greatest fun comes from breaking it. We move now into the late 1960s, to a film that lovingly, brilliantly parodies every trope that Hammer had perfected, Roman Polanski's The Fearless Vampire Killers. The film is a fairy tale, a snow globe world of haunted castles and clumsy heroes, and garlic is everywhere. It is not just present, it is a running gag. The innkeeper Shaggle and his family are draped in it. They wear it like jewelry. They hang it like Christmas decorations. The hero, the bumbling Professor Abroncius, is a firm believer in its power. The comedy comes from how utterly mundane this supernatural ward has become. The characters treat their garlic braids with the same casualness as a winter coat. The film's most brilliant stroke of satire comes when Shaggle, having been turned into a vampire, returns to menace his beautiful daughter. He is stopped not by a cross, for he is a Jewish vampire, he explains with a shrug, but by the sight of the garlic she instinctively holds up. He recoils, but then a new vampire, his vampiric maid, floats into the room and is similarly repulsed. The two vampires, snarling and hissing, are held at bay by a terrified young woman and a bunch of vegetables. The scene is utterly absurd and utterly brilliant. It shows us that the trope has become so powerful, so universally recognized, that it can now support the weight of comedy. To laugh at a monster's weakness is to rob it of its power, and in that snowy, farcical world, garlic became less a shield and more of a punchline, a sign that we, the audience, were now in on the joke. The journey doesn't stop there. Once a trope has been established and then satirized, the next logical step is to deconstruct it, to take it apart, and ask why it was ever there in the first place. This brings us to the revisionist era of the vampire, most famously embodied by Anne Rice's 1976 novel Interview with the Vampire, and its subsequent film adaptation. Anne Rice did something radical. She told the story from the vampire's point of view. She invited us inside the monster's mind, to feel its loneliness, its pain, its eternal struggle with its own nature. Her vampires, Lestat and Louis, are not feral beasts or demonic spirits. They are tragic, romantic, philosophical beings trapped in an immortal existence. And to make us empathize with them, to allow us to see the world through their predatory eyes, she had to strip away the old folklore. In the world of Anne Rice, there is no fear of garlic, no recoiling from crosses, no vulnerability to running water. She dismissed these as peasant superstitions, the foolish, fearful tales of mortals who could not possibly comprehend the true nature of her creatures. This was a deliberate and profound choice. The old weaknesses, especially garlic, served to place the vampire firmly in the category of other. They were a way of drawing a line. On this side, we have humanity, with our wholesome foods, our faith, our connection to the earth. On that side, we have the monster, which is repelled by all these things. By removing that line, Anne Rice forced a difficult question upon the audience. What is the real difference between us and them? If the vampire is not a demon to be warded off with folk remedies, but a creature with its own consciousness, its own history, its own sorrow, then the moral calculus becomes infinitely more complex. The absence of garlic in Interview with the Vampire is one of the most significant moments in the plant's cultural history. Its silence is deafening. It signals a shift from a story about good versus evil to a story about the torment of existence. The focus moved from the external threat of the monster to the internal landscape of its soul. To give the vampire a soul, you first had to take away its simple earthy kryptonite. And that brings us to the modern era, a landscape where all the old rules are optional. We now have what you might call a cafeteria mythology. Storytellers pick and choose the vampiric traits that best serve their narrative. In a show like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the classic folklore is lovingly embraced and then remixed. Garlic, crosses, and sunlight are all effective, part of a toolkit for a hero fighting a very clear and present evil. The show understood the power of the old symbols and used them to ground its very modern, self-aware story in a classic tradition. Then you have a phenomenon like the Twilight series. Here, the deconstruction started by Anne Rice is taken to its logical conclusion. The vampires are not just sympathetic, they are the romantic heroes. They are beautiful, brooding, and utterly disconnected from the folkloric monster of old. They sparkle in the sunlight. They possess unique superpowers, and of course they have absolutely no aversion to garlic. To even imagine a scene where the Cullen family recoils from a plate of pasta aglio e olio is to realize how fundamentally different these creatures are. The story is not about horror or survival, it is about romance, choice, and belonging. Garlic, the symbol of an earthy, humble, old-world defense, has no place in this glossy, modern high school romance. Its absence tells us everything we need to know about this new breed of vampire. They are not a blight on nature. In their own way, they have become an idealized form of it. Faster, stronger, more beautiful. The conflict is no longer between the natural and the unnatural. So the symbol of that conflict, the humble garlic bulb, is quietly retired. Looking back, it's a remarkable journey. From a subtle implication of natural remedies in a silent German film, to a codified rule in Hollywood's golden age. From a vibrant sensory shield in the Gothic castles of Hammer horror, to a beloved punchline in a satirical comedy. From a deliberate, meaningful absence in a tragic revisionist romance, to a forgotten relic in a modern fantasy. The story of garlic in the cinema is the story of the vampire itself. As the monster evolved, so too did its weaknesses. It reflects our changing relationship with fear, with folklore, and with the natural world. In the beginning, when the vampire was a metaphor for disease and foreign invasion, we armed ourselves with the most ancient and trusted of medicines, a real-world protector from the unseen. As the vampire became a figure of tragic romance, we stripped him of these simplistic weaknesses to better understand his complex soul. Through it all, the little bulb of Allium Sativum has been a constant, even in its absence. It remains in our cultural memory, a potent symbol waiting to be used, subverted, or ignored. It is a testament to the power of a simple biological reality to plant a story in our imagination so deep that it can flourish and change for over a century, forever tying the fate of a humble garden vegetable to the myth of the immortal predator. It is a quiet reminder that sometimes the most enduring stories are the ones that grow from the ground up, rooted in the real, tangible, and wonderfully pungent world we all share.